So with the election being just a few days away, I thought this would be the perfect opportunity to talk about the psychology of voting and the psychology of politics in general. In the past few years, we've seen some interesting trends in voter interest and political philosophy. We've also seen both parties develop serious worries about the future of the country, with both sides certain that this election is the most important in US history.
This is likely to be the most important election of our lifetime.
As you know, I think that this is the most important election in our lifetime.
This is the biggest election, the most important election we've ever had.
This is the most existential, consequential, and important election of our lifetimes.
As we will see, both parties have developed this fantasy and projected it onto the other. By evaluating this dynamic, we should better be able to understand politics in general, but ultimately better understand ourselves as well. And before we get any further, I do want to mention that my own political stance will not be mentioned in this video. This video is only to evaluate the psychology of it. And as you'll see, we're not really going to discuss any specific policy positions anyways. With nearly 40% of people feeling their views are not well represented by either political faction, the dissatisfaction with the two-party system has never been higher. And obviously this begs the question, why do we even have the two-party system to begin with? I want to emphasize that I do not discount the history of these two parties, their development, and current systems in place that preserve their existence. What I'm looking at is to evaluate this question purely from the psychological perspective. So most fundamentally, the function of the human brain is to take in what is a huge amount of information from the environment and actually select what it is that's relevant. There are tons of different estimates now, but it's as high as 95% of the information that we take in is filtered unconsciously, and we only actually pay attention to about 5% of it. In cutting down this data from the 100% to the 5% that is relevant, requires the function of discrimination, division, and categorization. We see that not only is this a very fundamental experience of reality and how we engage with it, it's also a very fundamental element of reality. Humans are in a long list of animals that organize themselves in two halves, sexually express themselves in two ways, and have a mental organization that involves a conscious and unconscious element. I think that this basic fact of how we organize and interact with reality also influences how we perceive reality. As a result, we create these dualities such as day and night, heaven and hell, right, wrong, life, death. So the ultimate question here is, why do we do this, and why does it manifest itself in politics aside from being an innate impulse? The first reason why we do this is because it's easier. It conserves mental energy. It's easier to divide something into two pieces than it is to divide it into a spectrum. Second is that it aids in the categorization that I mentioned previously. We know that categories are not an inherent element of reality. Categories are something that we project onto it. I think a perfect example of this is the color spectrum, right? There's an unlimited amount of colors and no two colors are the same, but we categorize them into, I think, 12 different colors because we're projecting that categorization onto reality, not because it's inherent in colors. So this tendency to split things results in what I believe is the most toxic element of politics. And it results in nuanced and mediating voices being completely ignored or not arising in the first place. So here's an excellent example of how this works. So here on the spectrum, we can imagine that candidate A takes a stance on educational costs and states all education should be free. Candidate B comes along and states that educational costs should be free for all students that complete their education. What we see in this example are two positions that are nearly identical. They're so indistinguishable from each other that a real argument is not going to ensue. So using what we've just discussed, it's difficult to categorize these two perspectives as different. In this representation, the text color of each candidate corresponds to where they point on the spectrum. As you can see, the two colors are very difficult to distinguish. You may have not even been able to notice a difference between them when you first saw them. Now comes candidate C. On the same policy issue, they state that education should not be free. It should be paid no matter if you complete it or not. Now, this is a different enough position where an opposing stance can be identified and a decision can be made whether or not somebody is going to support that position. In other words, it's very easy to categorize this as a distinct position and a competing position than candidate B. So here we see the two-party system as an expression of innate human biology, ultimately arising from the need to distinguish oneself far enough from the other party to be recognized as a distinct entity. And this is done ultimately to ease the categorization of voters so they can determine whether or not they want to support that position. Another application of this dichotomous thinking that we discussed in the previous section is used by every organism on the planet to distinguish between itself and everything that is not itself. This process is very important for human development in particular, since when the child is born, it actually has no concept of what is itself and what is not. It perceives the mother as itself. It doesn't recognize it as a distinct entity yet. However, as we develop, we learn to distinguish ourselves from our mother, both physically and psychologically, and this also corresponds to the development of a unique identity. An extension of this basic human fact can be seen in group behavior, where it's very important for us to distinguish between our in-group and our outgroups. As far as ideologies to categorize people in, there is no larger and well-known one than the political dichotomy, at least not in this day. So in other words, the political parties, by including tons of different ideological positions, render themselves as extremely useful for categorization. As you can see in this graph, political ideology for this reason becomes a powerful predictor of whether or not someone will get married. 72% of Republicans will marry another Republican, 75% of Democrats will marry another Democrat, and this was the most surprising one for me, 78% of independents will marry another independent. The second thing I want to talk about in this section is the nature of projection. A professor of mine once said, it's easier to project your problems onto other people and kick them out of your life than it is to actually face your own problems. It seems to me like the political parties have become somewhat of a shadow of one another, where one party might value rational scientific discovery, rational scientific consensus. The other party then values more conspiratorial thinking, intuitive thinking, questioning status quo. One of the parties might value social support, while the other party values more self-sufficiency. But the point I want to emphasize is that each party receives the projection of what the other party excludes from their own ideology. You can see it represented in this graphic here. Projection begins with the construction of a worldview, which can be seen on the left. In our lives, we will pick certain traits or philosophies to abide by. And for example, I commit to making decisions based on rationality and scientific consensus. What happens is that I may unconsciously start to devalue other approaches, such as intuitive or alternative perspectives, even if they offer valid insights. The point that I really want to emphasize here is that in order to pick something that you are going to identify with, you have to cut the other side out and essentially demonize it. Push it down into the unconscious, into your shadow. What happens is over time, over decades of abiding by this personal philosophy, it becomes a part of your identity. Then when somebody comes along and challenges this principle that you have laid as the cornerstone to your identity, it feels extremely threatening. Essentially what's happening in the political atmosphere from this perspective is that you project unconscious contents on the other person in order to distance yourself from it even further. Then you can push them out. This results in both parties seeing the other as extremely dangerous and threatening to the fabric of the country, and also results in news outlets calling every election the most important. What we're seeing unfold is a fantasy. Now, something we have to consider in the political atmosphere is who is attracted to politics in general. Who is it that forms a good leader, or at least a leader that is perceived as good? So it's very common for people to say that all politicians are the same. They all speak, talk the same. In some cases, they look the same. And this is because I don't think it's that crazy. Just every single profession that exists self-selects for a certain type of person. There's also a preference among voters that is very clear. Research has shown time and time again that voters prefer confident, extroverted, assertive, and somewhat disagreeable politicians, despite research showing that these are not the best traits in a leader. With just these 4 characteristics I mentioned, you can already start to form kind of a picture of the person that matches these characteristics in your head. There are also certain experiences that are nearly prerequisites for political leadership, that is either law school or military service. I want to be clear, there's nothing wrong with either of these professions. What I want to emphasize is that we know a specific type of person will gravitate towards those professions. This may look like a very obedient person, a person able to follow rules and regulations. It may also mean a very diligent person, and at the same time a person who's very good at linear thinking. To emphasize this point even further, just imagine if we had a prerequisite that everybody running for president must be a shaman or something, right? It completely changed the picture of the person we think would be the president. This is something that came up in one of my classes the other day, is that anytime somebody wants to be a leader in any situation, it could just be the classroom, but especially as a president, there is a level of narcissism that comes with it. I want to be clear, I don't mean this as a diagnosable mental illness. but simply as a personality trait. So why is it that we prefer this type of leader? I believe it's a reflection of human development. So throughout our lives, especially when we're very young, we have the capability to turn into literally everything. But ultimately, one type of person, one personality emerges among the literally limitless possibilities. For our personality to emerge, there must be a psychological assertiveness, narcissism, disagreeableness, confidence, and extroversion. No matter your personality, these traits must inform the personality structure that emerges as the dominant force in one's identity. We actually observe this developmentally. The brain of a child does not construct a personality out of thin air, rather it's like a sculpture being created by the removal of stone. Neural pruning is what occurs. All the potential identities that we can take on are killed to preserve one specific one that is formed by a mixture of biology, psychology, and sociology. So in reality, the political leader is a reflection of all of us. It's a reflection of normal ego development through childhood. The last thing I want to mention in this section is that politicians are not a homogenized groups of either saints or sinners. I don't want to rob the individual of their own agency. There are good politicians, there are bad politicians, and there's also this kind of archetypal politician that we're discussing. Something that goes hand in hand with that, which may be already apparent throughout this video, is that the politician is a reflection of the voter. So in reality, political candidates have adapted to us. It's very easy to point a finger at the system and to test it, but in reality, we all bear the burden. So obviously this leads to the final question: is there hope for the future? I think many will be surprised by my answer, given that I've presented a very deterministic view of politics, something that may seem very inflexible. But I do believe there's hope, and I believe there's a lot of hope. To argue this point, I'm going to use some concepts of psychoanalysis. The psychoanalytic perspective of psychological effort and energy has its basis in physics. Essentially, it obeys certain principles such as energy cannot be created nor destroyed, and that energy exists due to the attention of opposites. You can think of it like a positive and negative charge that want to come together. There's energy in that process. We already feel it in the air. There's tension. There's been tension for a very long time, and it feels like something has to happen. Another way to think about this is just psychological effort. And right, it takes effort to have two parties. It takes effort to make a third party. So is there a possibility that psychological effort can be channeled into bridging this gap? But I want to bring up one more example to help this make more sense, is that the tension can be thought of as a movement from equilibrium. For example, when we're not hungry, we're not that motivated to go get food. We don't need to. But if you are hungry, you're pulled further and further from that state of satisfaction, of satiety. There becomes more and more motivation to go find food and to bring your state closer to equilibrium. So how does this apply to politics? In general, periods of extreme tension can be relieved in 3 different ways, and we'll look at them one by one. The first is to break the tension by eliminating one side. In extreme forms throughout history, this is materialized in civil war, where the tension is so high, the effort is poured into eliminating the other perspective or breaking it off permanently. But what is important is that this involves the utilization of that energy in a process of introversion, and really becomes extremism by inflating that perspective that remains. The second is to bring the two perspectives closer together, to bring the positive and negative closer together. I find this very unlikely to occur when I speak to people of both parties. I find it super fascinating that they have the perspective that the other is moving further and further away from the middle, that both perceive the other as getting more and more extreme. What is important here in the graph is that if you merge them together, the energy is then utilized to transform them. This is just like a chemical reaction. When you bring them together, bring two chemicals together, they're no longer the same, and the energy has been utilized to create bonds. The third and final thing that can happen is the emergence of a new perspective. If attention, effort, and motivation are derived from tension, then it's only in times of tension where a third party can emerge. This also goes back to what I mentioned previously, where to have a policy position that can gather support, it must be very different from the other party's position. You can imagine that if the two parties get further and further apart, then the mediating position will be so different from the other two that it will foster discussion, argument, and actually develop support. So as we can see, the current political landscape is clearly an expression of human biology. Our tendency to dichotomize, to identify who is us, who is them by offering an extremely powerful tool to essentially judge people. Furthermore, the political system is an expression of internal psychological dynamics, whether it's projecting our own shadows onto other people or favoring certain traits that are actually our own. And though this results in worrying levels of tension, it is tension that creates change. But obviously it absolutely depends on how we handle that tension. And just as the political environment we've created is based on individuals, the solution is also the burden of the individual. It is us individually that must deal with the tension. I want to end this video with a quote by Carl Jung when he was asked if there would be a third world war. He said, "I think it depends on how many people can stand the tension of the opposites in themselves. If enough can do so, I think the situation will just hold and we shall be able to creep around innumerable threats and thus avoid the worst catastrophe of all, the final clash of opposites in an atomic war. But if there are not enough and such a war should break out, I'm afraid it would inevitably mean the end of our civilization, as so many civilizations have ended in the past, but on a smaller scale."